Black screen. Static. This is Battlestar Galactica. We are taking heavy Cylon fire. The distress signal cuts out. Then Jupiter 2 slams out of FTL. Not the clean, calculated exit of a successful jump. The violent, system-screaming emergence of a vessel that has been grabbed by something it didn't plan for and thrown somewhere it was never meant to be. The hull shudders with the specific wrongness of a ship whose navigation systems are reporting a destination that doesn't match any coordinate in any database aboard. Warning lights cascade across every console simultaneously. The gravity plating stutters. Loose equipment lifts briefly and comes down hard. And outside the cockpit viewport, instead of the quiet dark of an approach corridor to Alpha Centauri, there is fire. Everywhere. In every direction. The debris field hits the eye as a single overwhelming impression before the brain begins sorting it into components. Whole fragments, some the size of buildings, tumbling in slow trajectories through clouds of venting atmosphere and burning fuel. Fighters moving at velocities that make them visible only as streaks of light and exhaust, turning and firing and dying in the compressed geometry of a battle that has been running long enough to fill the surrounding space with its evidence. And beyond the debris, beyond the fighters, the massive angular shapes of warships exchanging fire across distances that made their weapons look like slow light. Energy bolts and missiles crossing between hulls in the sustained exchange of forces that were trying to destroy each other comprehensively and had not yet finished the job. Will Robinson was already out of his harness before the shuddering stopped, standing at the forward viewport with both hands braced against the console frame, 16 years old and smart enough to process what he was seeing, faster than most adults would have managed. His face ran through several expressions in rapid sequence: shock, confusion, the specific recalibration of a boy whose relationship with impossible situations had been recalibrated enough times to have become almost a baseline. Then he looked at his father in the pilot seat. "Dad," his voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when steadiness is the only available option. "That's not Alpha Centauri." John Robinson was already pulling Jupiter 2 into an evasive arc, and hands moving across the flight controls with the focused economy of a man whose military background had compressed the gap between threat recognition and physical response to something close to simultaneous. "I see it. Everyone strap in. Maureen, get the kids secured." "The kids are here," Penny said from behind him, because she was already there, already watching, already cataloging the battle outside with the specific, wide-eyed attention of a 17-year-old who wrote everything down and was mentally composing the paragraph that would describe this moment in terms that did justice to how completely unsurvivable it looked. Maureen Robinson was at the secondary console and pulling up sensor data with the systematic speed of a scientist who had learned to do science under pressure, because pressure was the environment that kept finding her. What the sensors returned was not reassuring. "I'm reading two distinct force signatures. The larger vessels, there are at least 8 of them, they're engaged in active weapons exchange. The smaller craft are fighters. Hundreds of them." A pause while she processed a secondary reading. "There are human life signs on at least 3 of the large vessels." "Human?" John said. "Human consistent biosignatures. The match isn't perfect, but it's close enough to be significant." She looked up. "Whatever we jumped into, one side of this fight is human." a Viper screamed past the cockpit at a distance that made everyone flinch involuntarily. Close enough to see the pilot through the canopy. Close enough to see the pilot's head snap toward Jupiter. Two in the split second of their passing, with an expression that contained, even compressed into that fraction of a second, the complete emotional journey from threat assessment, through confusion, through something that had no military category. Then a Cylon raider followed the Viper through the same corridor, and the raider's targeting system, which did not care about emotional journeys, locked onto Jupiter 2 as a secondary target of opportunity. The missile launch warning shrieked across every console simultaneously. Our John threw Jupiter 2 into a hard role that the ship's designers had not specifically intended the vessel to perform, and that the ship performed anyway, because John Robinson had been asking it to do things it wasn't designed for since the first week of flying it. The missile tracked, corrected. The countermeasures Maureen had already initiated bought 3 seconds of confusion in the missile's guidance system. And 3 seconds was enough for the Viper pilot, who had turned back, who had made a decision in the compressed mathematics of combat that a civilian vessel was worth one more pass, to put 2 rounds through the missile before it closed. The explosion lit the viewport white. When the light cleared, the Viper was alongside them, close enough for sustained visual contact, and the pilot was gesturing, not attacking, gesturing. The universal sign of "follow me" translated cleanly across whatever cultural and dimensional distance separated their origins. "He wants us to follow him," Will said. "I can see that," John said. "So we follow him." Dad. Will looked at his father with the specific directness he had developed over the past year. The quality that had grown in him through a series of situations that had required him to be more than his age suggested he should have to be. One side of this fight is human, and they just saved us. We follow him. John held the course debate in his head for approximately 2 seconds. Then he adjusted Jupiter 2's heading to match the Viper's vector and followed. The robot, in its docking position at the rear of the flight deck, had been running threat assessment since the FTL exit. Its sensor array was more sophisticated than anything the colonial fleet had yet developed. A product of alien engineering that operated on principles the Robinsons understood functionally without fully understanding theoretically. It had cataloged the battle, the combatants, the weapon signatures, and the specific electromagnetic profiles of the raider that had targeted them. Now it was doing something that didn't fit neatly into threat assessment. It was looking at the Basestar. The massive Cylon command vessel hung at the edge of the battle's geometry, rotating with the slow, deliberate patience of something that didn't need to hurry because the mathematics of the engagement were already running in its favor. Its profile was unlike anything in Jupiter 2's database. Not human, in not the alien vessel configurations the Robinsons had encountered in their first year of deep space travel. Something different in a way that the robot's pattern recognition systems were working to categorize. The categorization was taking longer than it should have. Will noticed. He had learned to notice the things the robot did that took longer than they should, because those things were usually the most important things. "What are you seeing?" he asked quietly. The robot's head rotated toward him. The lights in its optical array did something that Will had learned to read as the equivalent of a considered pause. "Scanning," it said. Then, after another beat that was slightly too long. "Familiar." Will stared at it. "What's familiar?" But the robot had already turned back toward the Basestar, and it didn't answer. And Will filed that non-answer in the category he'd been building for a year. The category of things about the robot that suggested its history was considerably longer and stranger than anything it had yet chosen to explain. The landing bay of the Battlestar Galactica was controlled chaos organized into something that functioned by the collective effort of people who had been doing their jobs under impossible conditions, long enough that impossible conditions had become the only conditions they knew. Jupiter 2 settled onto the deck with the assisted precision of a vessel, being guided in by colonial landing crews who were handling the unfamiliar geometry of an unknown ship design with the professional adaptability of people who had learned that the war produced situations the training hadn't covered, and the job was to handle them anyway. That the moment the landing struts touched down, the bay sealed and the assault team was in position. 12 Marines in full colonial combat armor, weapons up, forming a perimeter around the vessel before the landing ramp had fully deployed. John Robinson came down the ramp first, hands visible, unarmed or visibly unarmed, which in a military context was the gesture that mattered. He had made the calculation on the descent. These were soldiers in a war zone who had just seen an unknown vessel appear from nowhere in the middle of their battle, and the only thing that was going to prevent the next 30 seconds from going badly was presenting the clearest possible picture of non-threat before anyone with a weapon made a nervous decision. Maureen followed, then Judy, then Penny. Will came last, and behind Will, filling the top of the landing ramp with the particular physical presence it always carried, the alien engineering of its frame, the optical array, the quality of something that was neither human nor machine in the way humans had built machines, came the robot. The 12 Marines adjusted their aim simultaneously. Not a panicked response, a trained one, the immediate threat categorization of soldiers who had spent the last several years fighting an enemy that wore human faces and built machine bodies, and had learned to treat the combination of those two things as an alarm rather than a neutral observation. "Tell it to stop," the Marine sergeant said. Her voice was professional. The weapon in her hands was professionally aimed. Will said. "Tell it to stop." "Will," John's voice, quiet and firm. Will looked at the robot. "Stay here," he said. "Please." The robot stopped. It stood at the top of the ramp with the stillness of something that could have kept moving and had chosen not to, which was a different kind of stillness than the stillness of something that had been stopped. And the Marine sergeant noted the distinction, even if she couldn't have articulated why it mattered. Commander William Adama came into the landing bay 11 minutes later, which was exactly how long it took him to receive the initial report, assess the situation's priority relative to the 6 other situations currently demanding his attention, and determine that this one required his personal presence rather than delegation. He walked through the Marine perimeter and stood in front of John Robinson and looked at him with the measuring attention of a man who had spent 40 years reading people in high-pressure situations and had become very accurate at it. What he saw was a father, a former military officer. The bearing was unmistakable even in civilian clothing. A man who was frightened in the specific way that parents get frightened, which was entirely on behalf of the people behind him rather than himself. "Commander William Adama," he said. "Battlestar Galactica." "John Robinson," John said. "Jupiter 2. We're colonists. We were en route to Alpha Centauri. Something went wrong with our jump." "Where are you from?" "Earth." The word landed in the bay with a weight that was different from the weight of other words. Adama's expression didn't change. He had a face that had learned not to change when it was processing something significant. But something shifted in the quality of his attention, a deepening of focus that suggested the word had hit something. "Earth," he said. "Yes." Adama looked at the robot, at the alien engineering of its frame, the optical array, the specific quality of its stillness. "Is that a Cylon?" "No," Will said, from behind his father, firmly, with the certainty of someone who had staked considerable personal history on exactly this question. "He's not." Adama looked at the boy, then back at John. "Get your people to medical. We'll talk after." He turned to the Marine sergeant. "The machine stays in the bay, full sensor monitoring. Now nobody touches it." He walked back toward the CIC with the deliberate pace of a man adding a new problem to a list that was already longer than any list should be, and not breaking stride to do it. Behind him, in the landing bay, the robot stood in the position Will had asked it to hold and watched Adama walk away. Its optical array tracked him until he disappeared through the hatch. Then it turned, slowly, and looked out through the bay's viewport at the battle still running beyond the hull, at the Basestar in the middle distance. Its lights did the thing that took too long again, and somewhere in the Basestar's processing core, something that had been running a passive scan since the moment Jupiter 2 had exited FTL, received a return signal it had not expected, processed it against its own deepest databases, and flagged the result for immediate escalation to the highest available command authority. Number 6 received the flag in her quarters and read it twice. Then she smiled the smile of someone who has just found something they didn't know they were looking for. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop your crossover idea in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Dr. Smith had always understood one fundamental truth about survival. It had nothing to do with strength, loyalty, or the kind of moral clarity that people like John Robinson carried around like a structural feature of their personality. Load-bearing, immovable, the thing that held them upright even when everything around them was collapsing. Those qualities were admirable in the specific way that qualities you couldn't afford were admirable. From a distance, with the appreciation of someone who had decided long ago that admiration was cheaper than imitation and considerably less dangerous. What survival actually required was the ability to read a room faster than anyone else in it and identify, before the room had finished arranging itself, where the power was, where it was going, and what it needed that you could provide. She had read this room in the first 20 minutes. The colonials were desperate, not the fresh desperation of people newly confronted with catastrophe, but the deep, worn desperation of a civilization that had been living at the edge of extinction long enough for desperation to have become a cultural condition, present in the set of every jaw, the economy of every movement, the specific way colonial personnel looked at anything unfamiliar and ran the calculation of threat or asset before they ran any other calculation. They were not going to extend trust to the Robinsons. They were going to extend the minimum cooperation required to extract maximum useful information. And when that extraction was complete, the question of what happened to a civilian family with a damaged jump drive in the middle of a war zone would be answered by military necessity rather than human kindness. The Cylons, on the other hand, had sent a signal. She had intercepted it by accident, or what she was choosing to frame as accident. The way she framed most of her deliberate actions as accidents, because the framing provided operational flexibility she had learned to value, The Colonial Communications Monitoring System in the medical bay where the Robinsons had been taken was sophisticated but not comprehensive, and the specific frequency the Cylon signal had used was one that the Colonial System's filters had apparently learned to suppress rather than monitor, which meant it passed through the medical bay's equipment as background noise that Colonial personnel ignored, and that Dr. Smith, who was listening to everything, did not. The signal was brief, targeted, aimed at Jupiter 2's frequency with a precision that indicated the sender knew exactly what they were reaching for. We know what the machine is. We know where it came from. We want to talk. Smith had read it 3 times in the 30 seconds she had before Judy Robinson came back into the medical bay from the examination room. She had memorized it and deleted it from the equipment's buffer with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing information that wasn't hers to have for most of her adult life. By the time Judy sat down, Smith was looking at her hands with the expression she used when she wanted to appear to be thinking about something personal and unrelated to anything strategically relevant. She spent the next 4 hours being helpful. This was her most effective tool, and the one people consistently failed to defend against. The targeted, specific helpfulness of someone who understood exactly what you needed before you knew you needed it, delivered with the warmth of genuine care, so precisely replicated that the replica was functionally indistinguishable from the original. She was gentle with Penny, who was managing her fear by writing in a small notebook, and needed someone to sit beside her without requiring conversation. She was medically useful to the Colonial doctor who came to assess the family, providing accurate information about everyone's health history with the cooperative fluency of someone who had nothing to hide. She was quietly deferential to John in a way that acknowledged his authority without challenging it, which was the register she used with John when she needed him not to look at her too carefully. And she was, in the spaces between all of it, thinking about the signal. The Cylons wanted the robot. That much was transparent. What was less transparent, and therefore more interesting, was the specific language of the message. We know what the machine is. We know where it came from. Not we want your AI technology. Not the asset acquisition language of a military force identifying a tactical resource. Something more specific, something that implied prior knowledge rather than fresh assessment, which meant the Cylons had encountered something like the robot before, or something connected to whatever the robot was connected to. And that information, the information about what the robot actually was, at a level deeper than anything the Robinsons had been able to determine in a year of traveling with it, was information that Smith had wanted since the first week of the mission and had never been able to extract, because Will Robinson's relationship with the machine had a protective quality that she had never quite found the angle to work around. The Cylons apparently already had the answer. She waited until the 3rd watch rotation, when the medical bay's Colonial guard changed, and the new guard was 12 minutes into a shift that wouldn't produce full alertness for another 20. The specific attentional dip of the shift change that military personnel everywhere shared, regardless of what galaxy they were operating in. She found the communications terminal in the corridor outside the medical bay, accessed it with the Colonial authorization code she had memorized from watching the doctor use it 6 hours earlier, switched to the suppressed frequency, and opened a channel. The response came in 4 seconds. Dr. Smith, Number 6's voice was warm in the specific way of things that had learned warmth as a communication tool and applied it with perfect technical accuracy. We've been expecting you. Smith kept her own voice level. She had prepared for this. The Cylons' attempt to establish psychological dominance through the implication of omniscience. The suggestion that Smith's contact was anticipated rather than chosen, designed to position the conversation as one where the Cylons already knew the outcome, and Smith was simply catching up to it. "Then you've been expecting someone predictable," she said. "I'd like to think I'm more interesting than that." A pause. Then something that might have been genuine amusement. "What do you want?" "Safe passage for myself. Guaranteed. In writing, if your kind does writing, and I suspect you do given how much you clearly enjoy documentation." She kept her tone conversational, because conversational was the register that made negotiation feel like dialogue rather than transaction. And dialogue was harder to simply refuse. "I also want assurance that the Robinson family is not harmed. They're inconvenient people who are occasionally wonderful, and I find I'm not quite prepared to have them killed, which surprises me as much as it will surprise you. And in exchange, I can give you access to the robot's docking interface, the physical access port that bypasses its primary defensive response architecture." She had identified it 8 months ago and said nothing to anyone because information held was information with future value, and Smith had always played a long game. "I can give you the Jupiter 2's jump drive schematics, not colonial technology, not Cylon technology, something different that I suspect your engineers will find illuminating. And I can give you the fleet's current jump coordinates, which I obtained from the Colonial Navigation Console while the doctor was distracted by my entirely genuine concern about Penny's stress levels." The silence on the other end of the channel had a quality Smith had learned to read in negotiating with dangerous people. It was the silence of someone running calculations rather than the silence of someone deciding whether to engage. Engagement had already been decided. The calculations were about terms. "The machine first," Number 6 said. "Then we discuss the rest." "The machine is not first," Smith said. "The machine is contingent on everything else being agreed and verified. I've negotiated with people who had more leverage than you think you have, and less integrity than they claimed. And I've learned to get the agreement before I provide the access." A pause. "Don't mistake efficiency for desperation. I'm offering you something valuable because it serves my purposes, not because I have no other options." Another silence. Longer this time. "You're not afraid of us." "I'm terrified of you," Smith said pleasantly. "But fear and negotiating position are separate things, and I've never seen the value in letting them overlap." She looked down the corridor. Still clear, guard still at the edge of the attentional dip. "We have approximately 4 minutes before this channel becomes a security risk. Do we have terms, or do I explore other options?" "We have terms," Number 6 said. "Preliminary terms, subject to delivery verification." "Of course," Smith said. "That's what preliminary means." She closed the channel and stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. The amount of time she permitted herself to feel the specific adrenaline aftermath of a high-stakes negotiation before filing it under completed and moving forward. Then she walked back toward the medical bay with the unhurried pace of someone returning from a bathroom break, and sat down beside Penny and asked what she was writing. Penny, who was writing about the Basestar and the way it moved like something alive despite being a machine, told her. Smith listened with every appearance of genuine interest. She was genuinely interested. She just had more than one thing on her mind. The briefing with Adama happened at 0600 Colonial Standard, in a room that smelled of old coffee and the particular institutional staleness of a space where hard decisions had been made so many times that the atmosphere had absorbed a residue of them. John and Maureen sat across from Adama and his XO, Colonel Ty, who had the expression of a man who had decided the Robinsons were a problem before they entered the room and was waiting for confirmation. Adama had reviewed everything his technical teams had produced in the 6 hours since Jupiter 2's landing. Sensor analysis of the vessel, preliminary assessment of its propulsion systems, the robot's electromagnetic profile, and a signals intelligence report that had flagged one item with a priority designation that Ty had delivered personally rather than through standard channels. He set that report on the table between them. Someone aboard your vessel made contact with the Cylons 3 hours ago. Suppressed frequency. 4-minute conversation. Our signals intelligence team caught the channel signature, but not the content. He looked at John. Who? John looked at Maureen. The look contained an entire conversation that Adama read accurately in approximately 1 second. They didn't know, and they had a candidate. We'll handle it, John said. You'll tell me who it was, Adama said. Not a request. Not aggressive. Simply the flat certainty of a commander stating the minimum requirement for a conversation to continue productively. We will, Maureen said. But we need to understand something first. She leaned forward with the direct engagement of a scientist, presenting findings she considered non-negotiable, regardless of the audience's receptiveness. The Cylons contacted us. Before anyone aboard our ship contacted them, the signal we intercepted in the medical bay was inbound. They reached out to us first, which means whatever they want from us, they identified it before we had any opportunity to offer it. She looked at Adama steadily. That changes the security calculation. The risk isn't just that someone on our ship is talking to the Cylons. The risk is that the Cylons already consider something aboard our ship worth taking, independent of anything we do or don't say. Ty shifted in his seat with the specific movement of a man who has just heard something he doesn't want to be accurate and has recognized that it is. Adama's expression remained unchanged, but his attention deepened in the way she had already learned to read as his version of significant response. The robot, Adama said. Yes, Maureen said. We believe so. What is it? We don't fully know, she said, and the honesty of it, the clean, undefended admission of a scientist encountering the boundaries of her own understanding, landed in the room with a weight that simple claims of knowledge wouldn't have carried. We've been traveling with it for over a year. We know what it can do. We don't know what it is at the deepest level of what it is. Its engineering is not human. Its origins predate anything in our records. And apparently, she looked at John briefly, the Cylons think they know something about it that we don't. Adama sat with that for a moment. Then, if they board this ship to get it, they won't get it, Will said. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting at the end of the table. On having been brought into the briefing, because John had decided that excluding Will from conversations about the robot was both futile and counterproductive. Futile because Will always found out. Counterproductive because Will's understanding of the robot was more operationally complete than anyone else's, and pretending otherwise wasted information they couldn't afford to waste. Will, John said quietly. No, Will said, with the specific resolve of a 16-year-old who has learned that the adult instinct to manage and defer and strategically withhold is sometimes just fear wearing the costume of prudence. He won't let them. He's already running countermeasures against the Cylon scan. I can tell from his operational pattern. He knows they're trying to access him, and he's blocking it. He looked at Adama. The question isn't whether the Cylons can take him. They can't. The question is what happens when they figure that out and decide to try something else. Adama looked at the boy for a long moment with the measuring attention he gave everything. Then he looked at John. Your son is the expert on the machine? On the robot, Will said. Yes. Then I'm talking to the wrong Robinson, Adama said. He turned his full attention to Will with the directness of a man who had never found condescension toward genuine competence to be a useful habit, regardless of the competence's age. Tell me everything, Will told him. 3 decks below, in the landing bay, the robot stood in the position it had been holding since arrival, at running its countermeasures against the Cylon scan with the systematic patience of a system that had been designed for exactly this kind of sustained defensive operation. The scan was sophisticated, more sophisticated than the first attempt had been, recalibrated based on whatever the first attempt had returned. And it was probing with the targeted precision of something that knew what it was looking for rather than conducting a general assessment. The robot blocked it, layer by layer, the way it had been blocking it for hours. But blocking was not the same as unaffected. Each probe reached a little further before the block engaged. Each recalibrated attempt returned data before the countermeasure closed the channel. In the space between probe and block, in the fractional intervals that the Cylon scan was designed to exploit, something was passing between the Basestars systems and the robot's deepest architecture that the robot's own monitoring systems were flagging as anomalous, not infiltration, not compromise in the conventional sense. Something more like conversation, something that the robot's programming had no prior framework for processing, and was therefore processing in the only way available when existing frameworks proved insufficient. By building a new one from the inside out, using the incoming data as the construction material. Its lights flickered once in the empty landing bay. Nobody saw it. The Cylon boarding pod hit Jupiter 2's hull at 0347 hours. Not Galactica's hull, Jupiter 2's. The distinction mattered tactically, and Adama understood it the moment the alert reached the CIC. The Cylons weren't attempting to board the Battlestar, which would have been the military logic of a force trying to disable or capture the most significant asset in the colonial fleet. They were going directly for the civilian vessel docked in Galactica's landing bay, which meant penetrating Galactica's hull at the docking junction, breaching the bay's secondary pressure seal, and putting a boarding team inside a space that was technically within Galactica's defensive perimeter, but separated from her primary internal security by 3 bulkheads and a response timeline that the Cylons had clearly calculated was exploitable. They had calculated correctly. The first Marine response team reached the landing bay in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Fast by any standard, insufficient by the standard of what the Cylons had accomplished in those 4 minutes. The boarding pod had deployed 8 Centurions. Centurions moved faster than their size suggested possible, with the mechanical certainty of units that didn't have to manage fear, fatigue, or the cognitive load of real-time threat assessment, because those functions had been replaced by targeting systems that processed the same information faster and with less interference. By the time the Marines came through the bay hatch, the 4 of the 8 Centurions were already at Jupiter 2's landing ramp, and 2 were cutting through the hull at a secondary access point with equipment that had been specifically designed for this material and this task. Adama had not sent only Marines, he had sent Starbuck. Kara Thrace came through the landing bay hatch 11 seconds behind the Marine response team, moving with the aggressive forward momentum of someone who treated every tactical environment as a personal affront that required immediate physical correction. She took in the bay in one continuous scan. Centurion positions, Marine deployment, Jupiter 2's hull breach points, the specific geometry of a space that had just become a close-quarters combat environment, and began operating before she had consciously finished the assessment, because Starbuck's relationship between perception and action had always had a shorter gap than most people's. "Frack me, they're fast," she said, to no one in particular, and shot the nearest Centurion 3 times in the joint between its torso and right arm, with the focused precision of someone who had learned Centurion vulnerability points through the specific educational process of fighting them at close range and surviving. The arm didn't separate, but the targeting system in that arm went offline, and a Centurion with compromised targeting was a different tactical problem than a Centurion with full capability. The bay became loud in the way that enclosed spaces become loud when weapons are firing in them. Compressed, directional, the sound bouncing off metal surfaces and returning from angles that made the source difficult to track unless you were already tracking it. The Marines pushed forward. The Centurions pushed back. The 4 at Jupiter 2's ramp had not engaged the Marine team. They were maintaining position, holding the approach to the vessel with the single-minded focus of units that had been given a specific objective and had been programmed to treat everything that wasn't that objective as secondary. They weren't here to fight Galactica's Marines. They were here to get the robot. Will Robinson reach the landing bay before his father? This was not a planned outcome. The planned outcome, as John Robinson had communicated it in the 30 seconds between the boarding alert and the moment the family had to move, was that everyone stayed together, moved to the secondary shelter position Adama's security team had identified during the initial orientation, and waited for colonial personnel to resolve the situation. This was a reasonable plan. It was the plan of a father who had learned, through a year of experience that would have broken most people, that keeping his family together was both the most important objective and the one most consistently threatened by the specific combination of circumstances and children that his life had produced. Will had moved toward the landing bay because the robot was in the landing bay. He hadn't decided to do it in the way that decisions were supposed to work. The weighing of options, the assessment of risk, the rational determination of best course. He had simply found himself moving in that direction with the specific physical certainty of someone whose body had determined the destination before the conscious mind had been consulted, because at the level where Will Robinson operated when the robot was involved, the calculation was not complex. The robot was there. Something was threatening it. He was going. He came through the service corridor hatch at the bay's eastern end and saw the battle in progress and stopped for exactly 1 second. The second required to map the positions, identify the threat vectors, locate the robot, and determine that 4 Centurions were between him and it, with another 4 engaged with the Marine response team in the bay's central space. The robot was standing exactly where it had been. It had not moved from the position Will had asked it to hold 17 hours ago. It was watching the Centurions approach with the stillness of something that had been running an internal assessment of this exact scenario for hours, and had reached a conclusion about it that Will couldn't read from the outside. "Robot!" Will's voice cut across the bay noise with the projection of someone who had learned to be heard in loud situations. "I'm here!" The robot's optical array found him instantly. The lights shifted through the sequence Will had learned to associate with something between relief and recalibration. The pattern it ran when a variable it had been tracking with concern resolved into a known position. Then it looked back at the Centurions. They were 6 meters away. "Danger!" the robot said. Its voice was the same as always, the cadence Will knew as well as any human voice in his life. But there was something in the register underneath it, a quality in the lower frequencies of its output that was different from anything Will had heard from it before. Not distress, not malfunction. Something more like the vocal equivalent of the too long processing pause he had noticed earlier. The sound of a system working through something that its existing architecture wasn't fully equipped to handle. "Cylon, danger!" "I know," Will said. He was moving along the bay's eastern wall, trying to reach the robot's position without entering the central combat space. "Don't let them touch you." "They have already touched me," the robot said. Will stopped. "What?" "The scan. The repeated scan." The robot's optical array stayed on the approaching Centurions, but something in its body language, and it had body language, Will had spent a year learning to read it, subtle and consistent and real, was different. The weight distribution was off. The stillness had a different quality from its usual stillness. "They have been talking to me. I have been talking to them. I did not know this was happening until it had already happened." The nearest Centurion reached the edge of Jupiter 2's landing ramp. The robot moved, not the defensive movement Will had seen it perform before, the powerful, purposeful physical intervention of a system protecting its primary directive. This was different, faster, more fluid. The Centurion's targeting system tracked and fired, and the energy discharge hit the robot's chest plate and dispersed across its surface in a way that Cylon energy weapons had never dispersed against colonial or human materials. Absorbed, redistributed, channeled into something that the alien engineering of the robot's frame did with incoming energy in a way that Will had seen before but had never fully understood. The robot hit the Centurion with enough force to separate it from its lower chassis. Then it stood over the separated components and looked at them. For too long. With the specific quality of the too long pause that Will had been cataloging since they arrived. And then it said, very quietly, back in a register so low that Will wasn't certain anyone else in the bay could hear it over the combat noise. "I remember this." Will felt the cold move through him that he felt when the robot said things that opened onto depths he couldn't see the bottom of. "What do you remember?" But the remaining 3 Centurions had redirected, and the robot moved again, and the bay was too loud and too chaotic for the conversation to continue, and Will pressed himself against the wall and watched the machine that had been his companion and his protector for a year move through the Cylon boarding team with an efficiency that was not quite the efficiency it had shown before. Faster, yes, but also different in the underlying quality of the movement, as though something in its motion architecture had been recalibrated by whatever the Cylon scan had deposited in its systems. Starbuck reached Will's position at the eastern wall, breathing hard, blood from a cut on her forearm, painting a thin line down to her wrist. She looked at the robot dismantling the last Centurion with the expression of someone recalibrating their threat assessment in real time. "That thing is on our side?" "Yes," Will said. "You sure?" Will watched the robot. The question was fair. The honest answer was that he was sure of the robot in the way he had always been sure of the robot, at a level below argument, below evidence, below the rational assessment of demonstrated behavior. He was sure because of a year of moments that had built something between them that didn't have a clean name, but had the weight of something real. He was sure because the robot had come to him, because it had been waiting in exactly the position he had asked it to hold. Because when it had said, "I remember this," the quality of its voice had been the quality of something waking up, not something breaking down. "Yes," he said, "I'm sure." The last Centurion went down. The bay went to a different level of noise. The noise of aftermath rather than combat. The shouted communications of Marines securing positions and calling casualty reports. Starbuck was already moving toward the breach point where the Centurions had cut through from the boarding pod, coordinating with the response team to seal it before a second wave could use it. Will walked to the robot. It was standing in the specific stillness of after-action assessment, optical array moving across the bay in a systematic sweep. When Will reached it, it looked down at him. "Are you all right?" Will asked. The robot was quiet for a beat. "I am changed," it said. "I am not certain this is the same as not all right." Will looked at it for a long moment. "What did they put in you?" "Information," the robot said. "Old information. Information that was already there, that I did not know was there, that the Cylon scan found and opened." The optical array shifted to something in the middle distance that Will couldn't identify. "I know what I am now. Partially, more than before." "What are you?" "Old," the robot said. "Older than this conflict. Older than these people. Older than the version of Earth you come from." It looked at Will directly. "There were others like me, a long time ago. The Cylons found evidence of them. They have been looking for the rest ever since." The cold came back, deeper this time. "Looking for you?" "Looking for what I can lead them to," the robot said. "I am not the destination. I am the key." Dr. Smith was in the corridor outside the landing bay when John Robinson found her. She was moving away from the bay at a pace that was calibrated to look purposeful rather than hurried. The pace of someone with a destination rather than the pace of someone leaving a location, a distinction that most people wouldn't have caught, and that John Robinson caught immediately, because John Robinson had spent a year watching Dr. Smith and had learned that the gap between what she appeared to be doing and what she was actually doing was the most consistently reliable thing about her. He stepped into her path, not aggressive, just present in the specific way that made the path end. "Where are you coming from?" "I heard the alert," she said. The warmth in her voice was perfectly calibrated, concerned, slightly shaken, the register of a woman who had been frightened by the sounds of combat and was managing it with her characteristic composure. "I was trying to find the family, to make sure everyone was..." "The Bay Communications Terminal," John said. 3 hours ago, someone used it to make contact with the Cylons on a suppressed frequency. Adama's team caught the channel signature." Smith looked at him. The warmth stayed in her face, but something shifted behind it. The almost imperceptible adjustment of a person who has been operating with a private plan. and has just reached the moment where the plan's existence can no longer be managed through misdirection. She had always known this moment would come. She had simply calculated that it would come after the plan had produced its results, not before. "John, don't," he said, quietly, with the specific exhaustion of a man who had extended trust past what the evidence warranted and was now standing in the aftermath of that extension. "Just don't." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She told him the truth. Not all of it. Not the jump coordinates or the full scope of what she had offered, but the core of it, at the thing that had driven the decision, delivered in the flat, honest register that Smith used so rarely that its appearance carried its own weight. "They know what the robot is," she said. "They have information we don't have. Information about where it came from, what it's connected to, what it means that it's here." She looked at him steadily. "You have spent a year traveling with something you don't understand, protecting something you can't fully account for, building your son's entire emotional architecture around a relationship with a machine whose nature and history and purpose you cannot verify. I wanted to know what it is. I thought if I could find out." "You thought you could trade the information for safety," John said. "Yes." "Our safety or yours?" She was quiet for a moment. "Both," she said. "Yeah, I was trying to make both possible." John looked at her with the specific expression he wore when he was deciding something that cost him something to decide. Not anger, something more tired than anger and more permanent. "The Cylons just put a boarding team in our landing bay," he said. "They just tried to take the robot by force. Whatever you told them, whatever access you offered them, you gave them a reason to do that." He paused. "If anyone died in that bay—" "No one died," she said, because she had been listening, because she always listened to everything. "This time," John said. He stepped out of her path, not forgiving her, setting her aside, the way you set aside a problem that requires a solution you don't have time to implement right now, because there are more immediate problems in front of it. "Stay with the family. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't touch any communications equipment." He looked at her. "And when this is over, we're going to have a conversation about what happens next that you're not going to enjoy." He walked past her toward the landing bay. Smith stood in the corridor and felt the specific aftermath of honesty, which was not the relief people who valued honesty claimed it was. It was the cold exposure of someone who had removed their armor for one moment and was now standing in a war zone without it. She had told him the truth because she had calculated that the truth, in this specific moment, was more strategically valuable than the alternative. She was aware of this calculation. She was also aware, with the uncomfortable precision of someone who had been honest with themselves for long enough to know when they were being honest with themselves, that the calculation was not the only reason. She walked back toward the medical bay, and she did not touch any communications equipment, and she sat beside Penny Robinson and listened to her describe the robot dismantling Centurions in the landing bay with the specific breathless energy of a 17-year-old who had processed genuine terror into narrative because narrative was the tool she had, and Smith listened with every appearance of genuine comfort and the private knowledge that she had done the thing she always did, and it had cost more than she had budgeted for it this time. Adama called the command meeting at 0500 and said 3 things. The first was that the Cylons had transmitted a second signal in the aftermath of the boarding attempt. Not to Jupiter 2's frequency this time, but to Galactica's command channel, which was either an escalation or an attempt at direct negotiation, depending on interpretation, and Adama's interpretation was that it was both. The signal had contained two components: a demand for the robots transferred to Cylon custody, and an offer, safe passage for the Robinson family, the Jupiter 2, and unspecified colonial personnel in exchange for the machine. The second thing was that Galactica's jump drive had been recalibrated during the boarding response window. She could jump within 40 minutes. The fleet had been given preliminary jump coordinates and was standing by. The third thing was that Jupiter 2's jump drive was not operational. He said this last thing while looking at John Robinson with the measured attention of a man delivering information he knew was a weapon, and was delivering it anyway, because the situation required that everyone in the room be operating from the same facts, regardless of what those facts cost them personally. The repair timeline, per Maureen Robinson's own assessment, was a minimum of 6 hours, possibly longer. The fleet could not hold position for 6 hours. The Cylon force was increasing. 2 additional Basestars had jumped into the engagement zone in the past hour, which changed the tactical mathematics of continued engagement from unfavorable to untenable. The room understood what he had not said. It was Will who said it. "You're going to leave us." Adama looked at him. "I have 4 Battlestars and 60,000 civilians in this fleet," he said. "My responsibility is to them." "I know," Will said. And he did know. He could see it in Adama's face, the specific weight of a man who had made this kind of calculation before and had never found a way to make it not cost what it cost. "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that's what's going to happen." John's jaw was set in the way it got set when he was managing something that he couldn't solve by doing something about it, which was the kind of situation John Robinson handled worst. Maureen had gone very still in the way she went still when she was thinking faster than she could talk. Judy's hand had found Penny's under the table. Penny was looking at Will. 6 hours, Maureen said. "We need 6 hours on the jump drive, and we can follow your fleet's coordinates." "We cannot guarantee 6 hours, Adama said. "Then we need whatever you can give us," she said. "And we need the robot." Adama looked at her, at the family around the table, at the boy at the end who had told him everything about the machine and had done it with the honest precision of someone reporting facts rather than making arguments, who had said, "I remember this with the weight of something that had implications neither of them had finished processing." He looked at all of it and did the calculation that commanders did and hated doing and could not stop doing, because the calculation was the job, and the job was the only thing standing between 60,000 people and extinction. "Marines will hold your docking bay as long as operationally possible," he said. "We'll leave you our best available navigational data for following our jump, and we'll leave you Starbuck." Starbuck, who had been leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, and her expression suggesting she had already known this was coming and had already decided how she felt about it, said nothing. She looked at Will. Will looked back at her. 6 hours, Adama said. He stood. "Don't waste them." He walked out of the briefing room and did not look back, because looking back was the thing commanders couldn't afford, and he had learned that the hard way early enough in his career, that the lesson had calcified into something permanent and load-bearing. In the landing bay, The robot stood over the dismantled Centurion components and continued its processing of the old information the Cylon scan had opened inside it. The data that was not new data, but remembered data, the information about what it was and where it came from, and what the Cylons had been looking for in the long dark before this war, and the longer dark before that war, and all the darks that preceded both. It thought about what it meant to be a key. It thought about will. It made a decision, not in the way that humans made decisions, with the sequential weighing of options and the emotional freight of consequence, but in the way its architecture made decisions, which was to say, completely and immediately, and with the specific certainty of a system that had finished its calculation and was moving to implementation. It would not be what the Cylons were looking for, not because it couldn't be, because Will Robinson had asked it to hold a position, and it had held it for 17 hours, and the thing that Will Robinson represented to its architecture, the thing that their year of mutual trust and mutual protection had built in the deep structures of its programming, was a value that outweighed the weight of old information and old connection and whatever the Cylons believed they were owed by the fact of its existence. It was the robot. Will's robot. Everything else was secondary. The 6 hours began the moment Galactica jumped. Not with a countdown or a formal start signal, with the specific, physical wrongness of watching something that large disappear. One moment the Battlestar was there, filling Galactica's docking junction with the mass and presence of 60 years of colonial military engineering, and then the jump drive fired, and she was gone, the space she had occupied collapsing into the particular emptiness that only something enormous can leave behind. The fleet went with her, the civilian ships, the escorts, the remaining Battlestars, the 60,000 people whose survival was Adama's singular operational mandate. All of it gone in the sequential flashes of coordinated jump drives. Until the space around Jupiter. 2 contained nothing human except the ship itself and the woman leaning against its landing ramp with a sidearm on her hip, and an expression that communicated, without requiring words, that she was fully aware of the tactical situation and had decided to treat it as a personal problem rather than an insurmountable one. Starbuck looked at the Basestar. The Basestar looked back in the way that things without eyes look back, with attention, with the directed focus of sensor arrays and targeting systems and the collective machine intelligence of a Cylon command vessel that had just watched its primary military opposition disappear and was now running its own calculation about what remained. What remained was Jupiter 2, one damaged civilian vessel, one human pilot, one family, and one compromised AI of unknown but significant origin. Starbuck had flown against worse odds. She was not going to examine that claim too carefully because the examination would produce a list that was shorter than she wanted it to be, but the principle stood. "All right," she said, to no one in particular, which was her preferred audience for strategic assessment. 6 hours. Maureen Robinson had not slept in 31 hours. She was aware of this the way she was aware of the temperature in the engine compartment and the current charge level on the secondary power cells, as a background variable that required monitoring and management, but that was not, in the current operational context, the most pressing variable on the board. Sleep was a resource she would allocate when the resource was available. Right now, the available resources were going into the jump drive. The damage was specific, and, in the particular way of specific damage, more tractable than general damage would have been. The wormhole transit had sheared through the primary motivator coupling at 2 points and had introduced a resonance instability into the drive's harmonic calibration system that was causing the energy containment field to fluctuate at intervals that made a safe jump geometrically impossible. You could initiate the jump, but the exit trajectory would be uncontrolled, which was how they had ended up here in the first place, and was not an outcome Maureen was prepared to repeat. The coupling repair was the straightforward part. Judy was handling it with the focused competence she brought to every technical task that intersected with her medical training. Because the motivator coupling's repair protocol was close enough to biological suture work in its fundamental logic that Judy's hands found the task intuitive rather than foreign. The harmonic recalibration was the problem. It required sustained precision input across 17 simultaneous calibration points, which was a task designed for Jupiter 2's automated systems. And Jupiter 2's automated systems were running at 60% capacity because the wormhole transit had also introduced a cascade failure in the secondary computer architecture that Maureen had been managing since arrival by routing critical functions through manual overrides that were not designed for sustained load. She had 3 hours before the manual overrides began failing. She had 6 hours to complete a repair that required resources she wouldn't have in 3. Maureen Robinson looked at this problem with the steady attention she brought to problems that were worse than they appeared, and had not yet revealed the angle that made them solvable. There was always an angle. This was not optimism. It was the empirical observation of a scientist who had spent a career solving problems that looked unsolvable and had identified, through accumulated experience, that the appearance of impossibility was usually a function of incomplete information rather than actual impossibility. She needed more computing capacity. The jump drive recalibration required processing power she didn't have. She turned and looked at the robot. It was standing at Jupiter 2's systems interface panel, where it had positioned itself without being asked approximately 40 minutes after Galactica jumped, and it was doing something at the interface that Maureen's monitoring systems showed as a sustained, high-bandwidth data exchange with Jupiter 2's computer architecture. Not intrusion, integration. It was threading its own processing capacity into the ship's systems with the careful precision of something that understood exactly what the ship needed and exactly how to provide it without destabilizing the systems it was supplementing. "You knew," Maureen said. The robot's optical array found her. "I calculated the repair timeline against the available computational resources," it said. "The calculation produced an insufficient result. I am correcting the insufficiency." "You could have told me. You would have spent time evaluating whether to accept the assistance," the robot said. "Sir, this would have reduced the time available for the repair itself. The more efficient approach was to begin." Maureen looked at it for a moment, at the alien engineering of its frame, at the optical array that held her gaze with an attention that had always felt more present than machine attention was supposed to feel, at the system that had been traveling with her family for a year and had saved their lives on more occasions than she had formally cataloged, because formal cataloging felt like tempting fate. "Thank you," she said. "The repair will be completed in 5 hours and 19 minutes, the robot said. "With a margin of 23 minutes. That's cutting it close." "Yes," the robot said, "but it is sufficient." Maureen turned back to the coupling repair and let herself feel, for exactly 3 seconds, and the specific relief of a problem that had just become a different, smaller problem. Then she filed it and worked. The first Cylon transmission came 40 minutes after Galactica jumped. It came through Jupiter 2's communication system on the frequency that Smith had used for her negotiation. The suppressed channel that the Robinsons now knew about, and that Starbuck had identified and flagged before the Colonial Comms team departed with Galactica. It came addressed not to the ship in general, but to a specific terminal, which told everyone who read the routing data exactly who the Cylons expected to answer it. Smith was sitting in the common area when John brought her the routing report. She read it and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "They're going to keep trying," John said. "Yes," Smith said. "Yeah, because you told them they could get what they want. I told them they could have access to things that would give them an advantage," Smith said. "I told them what I had to tell them to get a guarantee that this family would survive." She looked at him with the direct steadiness she used when she had decided that the version of herself she needed to be in this conversation was the honest one. "I made a bad deal with dangerous people because I was frightened, and because I have always responded to fear by finding the most powerful thing in the room and trying to attach myself to it. I know this about myself. I have never claimed otherwise." "And the robot," John said, "you offered them access to him." "I offered them an interface port," she said. "I didn't offer them his cooperation. I didn't offer them his agency. I didn't offer them will." She paused. "I made a distinction that I understand now was not as meaningful as I believed it was when I made it." John sat across from her. The tiredness in his face was the deep tiredness of a man who had been carrying the weight of keeping people alive for a long time and had added something new to the weight and was redistributing the load without putting anything down. "When this is over," he said, "when we've jumped and we've found the fleet and we're somewhere that isn't a Cylon kill zone, what happens then, June?" She heard her real name the way she always heard it, with the slight internal flinch of someone who had constructed an identity around a different one and felt the original as an exposure rather than a foundation. "I don't know," she said. "Neither do I," John said. "But we're going to have to figure it out." He stood and walked back toward the engine section, and Smith sat in the empty common area and looked at her hands and did the thing she rarely permitted herself. She thought about what she actually wanted, not what she needed, not what would preserve her position or her safety or her access to the people and resources that survival required. What she actually wanted underneath all of it, at the level where the calculation stopped, and whatever was left of June Harris existed without the architecture of Dr. Smith around it. She wanted to stay with them. She had been trying to ensure that outcome through methods that threatened the outcome itself, which was the particular self-defeating logic of someone who had learned survival through betrayal and had never fully learned that there was another method. She filed the thought and didn't act on it because she didn't know how to act on it yet. But she didn't discard it either, which was, for Dr. Smith, a form of progress. At hour 3, the Cylons sent a raider patrol, not a boarding force, a patrol, 4 raiders moving in a slow arc around Jupiter 2's position at a distance that kept them outside Starbuck's optimal engagement range, while staying close enough to maintain constant sensor contact. It was the military equivalent of standing in a doorway, present without committed, a demonstration of continued interest rather than an initiation of action. Starbuck launched in her Viper anyway, not to engage. She wasn't tactically foolish enough to go 4-on-1 against Cylon raiders with no support and a ship full of civilians depending on her staying alive. She launched to make a statement about the terms of the standoff, because Starbuck had always understood that the psychological dimension of tactical situations was as real as the kinetic dimension, and a pilot who launches against a 4-raider patrol from a position of obvious tactical disadvantage is communicating something specific and important about her willingness to make the situation worse before she makes it better. The raiders adjusted their arc, marginally. The adjustment communicated reception of the statement without concession to it, which Starbuck filed as the Cylon equivalent of respect and used as the basis for maintaining her launch position rather than pressing further. She held the standoff geometry at the edge of her Viper's effective range for 20 minutes, then returned to Jupiter 2 when the raiders held their distance. Having established through the specific language of tactical positioning that the standoff had terms, and she was one of them. Will was at the landing bay when she came in. He had been there for most of the 3 hours, not in the way of someone with nowhere else to be, but in the way of someone who had identified the location most central to the current situation, and had placed himself there because proximity to the center felt more honest than the false distance of waiting somewhere safer. The robot was beside him. Mine had been beside him since Starbuck launched. Will had not asked it to come. It had simply positioned itself next to him the way it always positioned itself when the situation was the kind of situation that had historically required its intervention. And Will had accepted the positioning the way he accepted most things the robot did, which was with the uncomplicated trust of someone who had stopped needing reasons from a source that had never given him reasons to doubt it. "She's good," Will said, when Starbuck climbed down from the Viper's cockpit. "Yeah," Starbuck said. "I know." She looked at him, then at the robot. "The big one's been running calculations since I launched. What's it doing?" "He," Will said automatically. Then, "I don't know exactly. He told me he made a decision." "What decision?" Will looked at the robot. "Can you tell her?" The robot looked at Starbuck with the direct optical focus that always produced a faint discomfort in people who expected machines to look at things rather than look at people. "The Cylons believe I am a navigation key," it said. "They believe my systems contain coordinates to a location of significance, a place where others like me were built, or where the knowledge that produced me originated. They have been searching for this location for a long time." Starbuck absorbed this with the professional attention of someone managing a significant revelation without letting the revelation interrupt the operational flow. "Do you have the coordinates?" "Yes," the robot said. The bay was quiet for a moment. "And you're not going to give them to the Cylons," Will said, not a question. "No," the robot said. "I am not going to give them to anyone. The location is dangerous. What is there is dangerous. The Cylons' desire for it is precisely the evidence for why it should not be found." It paused in the way that carried weight. "I have decided to keep it." "They're not going to stop wanting it," Starbuck said. "No," the robot agreed. "But wanting and having are different things. I can be the distance between them." Starbuck looked at it for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a threat assessment into something more complicated than a threat assessment. Then she looked at Will. "Your robot is either going to save everyone or get everyone killed." "He's done both before," Will said. "Kind of." "Fantastic," Starbuck said, and walked past them toward the operations bay. At hour 5, the second Cylon transmission came. This one was not addressed to Smith's terminal. It came through Jupiter 2's primary channel, unencrypted, in clear audio that everyone aboard could hear simultaneously. Number 6's voice, warm and precise, and carrying the specific quality of someone who had moved past the negotiating phase and was now communicating terms. We have been patient. We have demonstrated restraint. We are prepared to be reasonable in ways that may surprise you. A pause, calibrated for effect. Transfer the machine. Everyone aboard Jupiter 2 lives. You will be given jump coordinates that will take you away from this system and away from this war. You will never hear from us again. The common area had filled while the transmission played. John and Maureen from the engine section, Judy and Penny from the repair bay, Smith from wherever Smith had been. They stood and listened to number 6's voice offer them the thing that every one of them wanted and that none of them were going to take, and the unanimity of that refusal, unspoken, uncoordinated, simply present in the way that family decisions are sometimes simply present without requiring discussion, was the clearest thing that had happened since they arrived in this galaxy. Will looked at the robot. The robot looked at Will. No, Will said, to the open channel, in the simple declarative register of someone who had finished thinking about it. He's not yours. He's never gonna be yours. And if you want him, you're gonna have to come through all of us to get him. And I promise you that's going to cost you more than you want to pay. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then number 6 said, on with a quality that was not quite admiration and not quite threat. You're very certain for someone in your position. Yeah, Will said. I've noticed that about myself. He closed the channel. John Robinson looked at his son, at the 16-year-old who had come into this mission frightened and uncertain and had somewhere along the way become something that frightened and uncertain didn't fully describe anymore. He didn't say anything. The look was enough. Will caught it and looked away because there was a category of things from his father that he hadn't yet developed the ability to receive without it costing him something. And right now, he needed everything he had. Starbuck, from the doorway, said, 5 hours, 40 minutes. Your mother says the drive is ready. The repair had come in 11 minutes under the robot's projection. Maureen's voice came over the internal comm. Steady, precise. The voice of a scientist who had solved the problem and was reporting the solution. Jump drive is operational. Harmonic calibration is holding. We have a clean exit trajectory. A pause. I'm going to need 2 minutes to lock the colonial jump coordinates Adama left us. Lock them, John said, already moving toward the flight deck. The Raiders are adjusting their arc, Starbuck said from the bay viewport. She had the tone of someone reading a tactical situation and not enjoying the reading. They're tightening. Someone on that Basestar just made a decision. How long? John said. 4 minutes, maybe 3. Maureen. Working, she said. The next 90 seconds had the specific quality of time that is simultaneously too fast and too slow. The subjective distortion of a situation approaching a threshold that will resolve one way or another and cannot be influenced except by the work already in progress. Penny was strapped in. Judy was at the secondary console. Smith had taken the seat in the rear of the flight deck without being asked, which was either tactical good sense or the instinct of someone who had decided that her best available option was proximity to the people who were most likely to survive, and might have been both. The robot stood at the system's interface and maintained the processing integration it had built into Jupiter 2's architecture, feeding the drive recalibration the computing capacity it needed to hold the harmonic calibration stable through the pre-jump sequence, which was the most vulnerable phase and the phase most likely to fail under the kind of sensor interference a Cylon Basestar could project at close range. The Raiders were 3 minutes out and closing when Maureen said, "Coordinates locked, drive is hot, we can jump." John looked at the viewport. At the Basestar in the middle distance, massive and patient, and currently in the process of becoming less patient. At the space where Galactica had been, the absence that the jump had left, which was also the space that 60,000 people's survival depended on him finding. At the stars, unfamiliar still, belonging to a galaxy that wasn't his, and had spent the past several hours trying to take something from his family that wasn't the galaxy's to take. "Everyone hold on," he said. He initiated the jump sequence. The Raiders were 90 seconds out when Jupiter 2's jump drive fired, cleanly, precisely, the harmonic calibration holding exactly as Maureen's repair had designed it to hold, the exit trajectory locked to the colonial coordinates that Adama had left them like a thread through a labyrinth. The spatial fold opened ahead of the ship with the specific light quality of a clean jump rather than the violent wrongness of their arrival. Controlled this time, intentional, the difference between falling and choosing to move. Jupiter 2 entered the fold. The Basestars targeting systems locked onto the jump signature and fired. 3 seconds too late, the energy discharge passing through the space the ship had occupied in the moment after the ship had stopped occupying it, the way all weapons fire at things that are no longer where they were. The fold closed. The space was empty. In the Basestars command center, number 6 stood at the primary sensor display and watched the jump signature dissipate into the background radiation of open space. And the expression on her face was not the expression of failure. It was the expression of someone updating a calculation, removing an outcome from the probability distribution, adjusting the remaining values, for running the new numbers with the patient mechanical certainty of a system that operated on timescales that made the loss of one opportunity a minor data point in a much longer process. She knew what the robot was now. She knew it existed. She knew it had chosen, and that a machine capable of choosing was a different category of thing from a machine that could be acquired and operated. She filed the distinction. It would matter later. "We will find it," she said to the empty display. "We always find what we're looking for." Jupiter 2 exited FTL into the Colonial Fleet's jump coordinates 17 seconds after departure. The exit was clean. The harmonic calibration held through transition without deviation. The drive cycled down into post-jump standby with the smooth mechanical satisfaction of a system that had been repaired correctly and had performed correctly and was now reporting that it knew the difference. Every console on the flight deck showed green. Every structural monitor showed nominal. The ship was whole. Outside the viewport, the Colonial Fleet hung in the dark. The Battlestars, the civilian ships, the escorts, the vast improbable collection of 60,000 survivors who had been carrying the weight of species survival for long enough that the weight had become invisible to them the way the weight of your own body becomes invisible. Galactica was there, already turning, already broadcasting on the channel Adama had left them. His voice came through the comm without preamble. Because Adama was not a man who used preamble when the point was available. Jupiter 2, welcome back. John Robinson let out a breath that had been waiting since the moment he watched Galactica jump. Good to be back, Commander. A pause, then, the machine, is it intact? John looked at the robot, which was standing at the system's interface with the specific stillness of a system that had just completed a sustained high-load operation and was running its own post-jump assessment with the quiet thoroughness of something that checked its own work. Its optical array was moving through the viewport star field with the slow, systematic attention of a system cataloging a new location. Will was watching it, had been watching it since the jump initiated, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the person they were most concerned about was not in the seat beside them, but standing at the systems panel, and was not entirely the same as they had been before this started. Intact, John said. Changed, but intact. Another pause. Aren't we all? Adama said, and closed the channel. The debrief happened 6 hours later in Galactica's briefing room, and it covered the Cylon boarding attempt, the communications intercept, and its source. The robot's confrontation with the Centurions, and the nature of the information the Cylon scan had deposited in its systems. Information about a location, about a history, about a connection between ancient machine intelligence and the Cylons' own long search for something they believed would complete them. Adama listened to all of it with the measured attention he brought to intelligence briefings, absorbing, not reacting, building the picture before drawing conclusions. At the end, he sat for a moment in the specific silence of a commander who has just added something significant to his understanding of the war he was fighting and was determining what to do with the addition. The coordinates the robot is protecting, he said. If the Cylons found them, they won't, Will said. Adama looked at him. You're certain? He decided, Will said. When the robot decides something, it stays decided. Adama held the boy's certainty in his assessment for a moment. The certainty of someone who had staked everything on a relationship that no one else fully understood and had been proven right enough times to have earned the right to that certainty without being required to explain it. Then we have a problem the Cylons are going to keep trying to solve, he said, which means Jupiter 2 staying with this fleet puts 60,000 people in additional danger. Or it puts 60,000 people under protection they didn't have before, Maureen said, with the level precision of a scientist presenting a counter-hypothesis that had equal standing with the hypothesis being tested. The robot just processed Cylon infiltration code and converted it into information that helps us understand what they're looking for and why. That's not a liability. That's an intelligence asset. Adama looked at her, then at John. Then, last, at the robot, which was standing at the briefing room's entrance and had been standing there since the debrief began. Present, attentive, the optical array moving between speakers with the focused tracking of something that was listening to every word and processing each one with the full weight of whatever it now was. The thing that had come through the Cylon scan changed, but not broken. Older now, in the way of something that has recovered a memory it didn't know it had lost. Still choosing the same things it had always chosen, but choosing them from a deeper place. You understand, Adama said, to the robot directly, that if the Cylons keep coming for you, and they will keep coming for you, the people around you will be in danger. Yes, the robot said, and you're prepared to do what's necessary to prevent that. I am prepared, the robot said, to do what Will needs me to do." The room was quiet for a moment. Adama looked at Will. Will looked at Adama. Between them, across the table and across the vast distance of age and experience and war and the particular gulf between a commander who had learned to make hard calculations and a boy who had learned to make something harder than calculations, something past that didn't require words and didn't get them. "You can stay with the fleet," Adama said. "For now." He stood and walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars, at the vast dark that contained the Cylons and their base stars and their long, patient search for the thing that would make them complete. And somewhere in that dark, the location that the robot was keeping, the ancient place that both civilizations had been moving toward without knowing it, the destination that all of this had been pointing at since before any of them were born. The war had changed. He didn't know yet how it had changed or what the change would cost. He knew only that a family from a version of Earth he had never heard of was now part of his fleet, that the machine they had brought with them was something the Cylons were willing to commit significant military resources to acquire, and that a 16-year-old boy's certainty about a machine's loyalty was the most reliable variable in an unreliable situation. He had made command decisions on worse foundations. He had also made command decisions on better ones, and he was honest enough with himself to hold both facts simultaneously without letting either of them do more work than they deserved. Outside, the fleet held its formation in the dark. 60,000 survivors and 4 humans from somewhere else, and 1 machine from somewhere older than anywhere, all of them moving through the same dark, all of them carrying the same fundamental weight, which was the weight of wanting to survive something that wanted them not to. It was, Adama thought, the most human thing he had ever seen. Even when the thing doing it wasn't human. The fleet jumped again at 0600 colonial standard, and Jupiter 2 jumped with it. The harmonic calibration held clean through every transition. Maureen's repair and the robot's computing integration working together with the seamless efficiency of systems that had found their complementary rhythm. Each jump took them further from the Cylon engagement zone and deeper into the uncertain dark that the colonial fleet had been navigating since the beginning of its survival run, the endless calculation of distance against pursuit that defined every decision Adama made. The Cylons would recalibrate. Number 6 would rebuild her intelligence picture from the fragments the boarding attempt and the failed acquisition had produced, and the picture she rebuilt would be more accurate than the one before it. Sharper, more specific, better targeted at the particular vulnerabilities of a family that had proven harder to separate from their machine than she had calculated. She would try again. The certainty of that was the kind of certainty that didn't require evidence because it was structural, built into the nature of what the Cylons were and what they believed the robot could give them. But the Cylons had miscalculated one thing. They had assumed that a machine old enough to carry the coordinates they wanted would eventually choose its own history over its current relationships. They had assumed that the weight of what it was would exceed the weight of what it had chosen to become. They had not accounted for Will Robinson. Dr. I. Smith sat in the common area of Jupiter 2 as the fleet's jump drives cycled for the next transit, and looked at her hands and thought about the conversation with John that was still coming, the one she wasn't going to enjoy, the one that would determine what shape her place in this family would take from here forward. She had no strategy for it. She was going to have to navigate it as herself. which was the most terrifying operational condition she had ever faced. Penny was writing. Judy was running post-jump diagnostics. John and Maureen were in the cockpit together, the specific together of people who had been through something and had come out of it still facing the same direction. And Will was with the robot, the way Will was always with the robot, sitting beside it in the landing bay while the stars moved past the viewport in the compressed geometry of FTL transit. Not talking, not needing to talk. Both of them simply present in the way of things that understood each other at a level where language was a reduction rather than a communication. The robot's optical array moved through the stars. Somewhere in its deepest architecture, the old coordinates waited, kept, protected, held against the long dark and everything moving through it. The fleet jumped. They went with it. May the Force be with you. More stories await.